It was a Saturday night when I first felt that gut-twisting sensation, the kind of feeling that gnaws at you in the quietest, darkest corners of your mind. I was lying in bed next to my wife, Sarah, who had her face buried in her phone, her lips stretched in a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. Normally, a smile like that would have made me happy. Sarah was acting strange, and it wasn't just that night. It had been this way for months. Our conversations had become superficial, as if she were talking to me out of duty rather than desire. She seemed distracted, distant, always too tired for a real conversation, but never too tired to chuckle at some text, to have her fingers dancing rapidly across her screen. And when I leaned over to sneak a glance at whatever seemed so amusing, she quickly turned her phone away, her smile evaporating as she shot me a glare. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's so funny?" "Nothing," she replied, her tone sharp and dismissive, like I was some annoying fly buzzing around. "It's none of your business, honestly." She slipped out of bed and shut herself in the bathroom. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the tension coiling tighter and tighter in my chest. None of my business? We'd been married 16 years, and now her life was suddenly none of my business? The next day, I couldn't get the thought out of my head. My mind ran through every possibility, and each one felt worse than the last. I thought about confronting her, but what would I say? That I didn't trust her because of a smile? I knew I had to keep my cool, be patient, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Little things that might have gone unnoticed before were now obvious and glaring. Her increased hours at work, the mysterious phone calls she'd take in a hushed tone, the business trips that never seemed to end when they were supposed to. And then there was her boss, Jake. I couldn't count the number of times she'd compared me to him, how he was this and he was that. Jake would never forget a date night. Jake was attentive, kind, understanding. All the things, apparently, that I was not. She brought him up so often that it was hard to believe it was by accident. My stomach twisted with jealousy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Ridiculous even. Still, there were times when I'd catch her looking at me like I was a stranger, like she was barely tolerating me. And as the days turned into weeks, the distance between us felt like a widening chasm, something neither of us could cross. I wanted to reach her, to bridge that gap, but every effort I made seemed to push her further away. I started reading books, researching ways to rekindle a struggling marriage. I'd buy her flowers, plan special dinners, try to talk to her about things that mattered. But no matter what I did, it was like pouring water into a sieve. Nothing stuck. Her response was cold, unfeeling, a half-hearted thanks or a forced smile before she drifted back to her phone or whatever else held her attention. It was after one of these dinners, a failed attempt to revive what we once had, that I began to suspect something darker. She'd been secretive before, but that night, as we lay in bed, she couldn't have been more obvious. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd snatch it up like it held her very breath, her fingers tapping out a reply faster than I thought possible. I turned over and tried to sleep, but sleep was impossible. All I could hear was the faint tapping of her fingers on the screen, like the tick of a clock counting down to some inevitable disaster. I needed to know what was going on, but I was scared of what I might find. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as nothing more than a rough patch. But the other part knew better. Deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. So, I waited. I told myself I'd confront her when the time was right, that I'd figure out what was tearing us apart. And that's when the real nightmare began. Days turned into weeks, and I became an observer in my own life, watching the scenes of my marriage unfold with an almost detached sense of dread. Sarah's laughter grew louder, but it wasn't with me. She started coming home late, always with some excuse about a last-minute meeting or an urgent project deadline, and I played the role of the understanding husband, nodding along even as every fiber of my being screamed that something was off. One night, as I was washing the dinner dishes, Sarah announced she'd be working late again. She didn't even look me in the eye, just muttered it like she was checking off a to-do list, as if her husband's reaction to her endless absences had become irrelevant. I felt my jaw clench, the frustration boiling inside me, but I kept it in check. I needed proof. Cold, Undeniable proof that I wasn't just spiraling into some paranoid delusion. A few nights later, I got my chance. It was around midnight, and I was tossing and turning, unable to sleep, when I heard her phone buzz. She was fast asleep next to me, oblivious to the storm brewing just inches away. My heart pounded as I reached over, hesitating only a moment before picking up her phone. I hadn't snooped through her things before, but I felt like I had no choice. I unlocked her phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through her messages. At first, everything looked normal: chats with friends, work emails, reminders. But then I saw a thread under the name Jake. My pulse hammered as I opened it. The messages hit me like a punch to the gut. Flirty exchanges, long paragraphs about things they'd never told their spouses. He was charming her, making her feel wanted, needed. And she was responding with the kind of warmth I hadn't seen in her eyes for a long time. I couldn't stop reading, my heart sinking further with each line. It wasn't explicit, not yet, but the undertone was clear. They were leading up to something more, testing boundaries, inching closer to a line they hadn't yet crossed. I put the phone back and lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling numb and sick. I'd given everything to this marriage, and here was this stranger beside me, laughing with someone else, sharing parts of herself I'd thought were reserved for me. The next day, I felt like I was moving through a fog. My world was spinning, but I kept quiet. I knew if I confronted her now, she'd twist it, maybe even lie, and I'd be left with more questions than answers. Instead, I called an old friend from college, Mark. He was one of those steady, no-nonsense guys who didn't take sides but could read people like an open book. If anyone could help me see straight, it was him. Mark listened quietly as I poured out my suspicions and everything I'd found. He didn't try to placate me or dismiss my fears. He just listened, which was more than I could say for Sarah these days. When I finally ran out of words, he sighed and said, "Look, man, it sounds like you need to dig deeper. If she's hiding something, it'll come out. You need to be smart about this." We hashed out a plan. I'd start keeping tabs on her, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. It felt wrong, but I had to know the truth. I couldn't live in the shadow of my doubts any longer. The next weekend, Sarah announced another work emergency, this time on a Saturday night. She kissed our kids goodbye with a cheerful smile, like she was just popping out for groceries. But as I watched her walk out the door, I knew I couldn't sit back and let her disappear into the night without knowing where she was going. After putting the kids to bed, I slipped out of the house and into my car. I followed her, keeping my headlights off, my heart racing as I stayed a safe distance behind. The route was familiar at first. She drove through town, past the usual places. But then she veered off toward the highway, and I knew right then that this wasn't a typical work emergency. She pulled into the parking lot of a hotel, a place far enough from our neighborhood that she probably thought she'd never be seen. I watched her step out of the car, wearing a sleek dress I hadn't seen her wear in years. My stomach twisted as she walked into the lobby, her phone clutched in her hand, her eyes scanning the room. I felt frozen, caught between the urge to confront her right then and there and the need to get undeniable proof. So, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, watching her disappear into the elevator. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was like I'd been hit by a tidal wave, and all I could do was sit there, drowning in the realization of what was happening. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. So I waited, each minute ticking by like a century, as I tried to decide just how far I was willing to go for the truth. I drove home in a daze that night, replaying the image of Sarah entering that hotel lobby over and over in my mind. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my vision blurred by the flood of emotions crashing over me. Anger, betrayal, humiliation. How long had she been playing me for a fool? Was I really that blind? Back home, I parked in the driveway and just sat there, trying to pull myself together. I couldn't go inside like this, not with the kids asleep upstairs. I'd always promised myself that whatever happened, they'd be protected from our issues. So, I took a deep breath and stayed out there for what felt like hours, my mind cycling through every moment, every red flag I'd ignored or explained away. It was a long time before I could muster the strength to walk inside, plastering a calm expression on my face that I barely believed myself. The next morning, I felt like I was sleepwalking through my own life. I made breakfast for the kids, listened to their innocent chatter about school and friends, and did my best to act like everything was fine. But inside, I was a storm. I wanted to confront Sarah the moment she came home, to demand answers, to tear down the lies she'd so carefully built up over the last few months. But when she finally walked through the door that afternoon, all I could do was watch her. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and went straight upstairs to shower. I watched her go, my fists clenched at my sides. Did she really think she could waltz back in here, carrying her secrets like hidden weapons? I knew if I went after her now, if I tried to drag the truth out of her, she'd deny it all, or worse. She'd twist it back on me, make me out to be the crazy one. I remembered Mark's words. Be smart about this. So, I waited. I forced myself to be patient, even as every nerve in my body screamed for action. I needed solid evidence, something she couldn't refute or explain away. That night, I went back to her phone, this time determined to leave no stone unturned. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages again, searching for anything that would confirm what I'd seen. And there it was. Her conversations with Jake were still there, but she deleted other parts of their exchanges, like she tried to hide the most damning evidence. But a few incriminating details had slipped through her cleanup. There were messages about business trips, about how he couldn't wait to see her again, and even a vague reference to their last night together. As I read, my anger boiled over. It was real. This wasn't just some passing flirtation or harmless office banter. She'd betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. My hands shook as I set the phone back down, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, none of which I could answer. Why him? Why now? After 16 years together, after all we'd built, all we'd been through, was I so easy to discard? But then I thought of the kids. I thought of how this would wreck their world if it came out the wrong way. I didn't want them to know their mother had turned our lives upside down for a man who was nothing more than a thrill. So, I decided to keep this secret to myself, at least for now. I'd get through this for them, for the sake of keeping their lives as stable as possible. Over the next few days, I started to pay closer attention to Sarah's every move. When she left the room to take a call, I watched her body language, noting every nervous glance, every guilty shuffle of her feet. She was careful, but not careful enough. She'd let her guard down, likely believing she was safe, that I'd never suspect her. It was almost laughable, really, how easily she'd fooled herself into thinking I'd never notice. Then, one night, she told me she'd be staying late again. I nodded, playing along, and kissed her goodbye as she left. But the moment the door shut behind her, I sprang into action. I called Mark, filling him in on everything that had happened since our last conversation. He didn't say much, just listened as I spilled every detail, from the texts to the hotel to the sickening sense of betrayal that had taken root inside me. When I finished, he was silent for a moment before saying, "You need to confront her, but do it on your terms. Don't let her make you the villain." His words struck a nerve. He was right. I was done playing the fool, done standing by while she lied to my face. I needed to confront her, to force the truth out into the open. But this time, I'd be the one calling the shots. The plan formed slowly, a mix of anger and desperation driving every detail. I'd follow her again, get irrefutable proof of her betrayal, and then I'd confront her somewhere she couldn't hide behind her lies. A part of me was terrified of what I'd find, but another part, the part that was sick of feeling powerless, was ready for the truth, no matter how brutal it might be. And so, I waited for the right moment, the right opportunity to catch her in the act. It was only a matter of time now, and as I prepared myself for what was coming, I knew one thing for certain. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything, was a stranger to me now. And soon, she'd have to answer for every lie she'd ever told. I kept to my plan, lying low, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to confront Sarah. Every time she left the house, my pulse would race, wondering if this would be the time I'd finally have enough evidence to shatter the charade she'd built. But it took everything in me to stay calm, to remind myself that I couldn't afford any mistakes. This confrontation had to be decisive, Unmistakable, undeniable. A week later, my opportunity arrived. It was a Friday night, and Sarah casually mentioned she'd be attending an out-of-town client dinner. She'd used this excuse before, and each time it left a bad taste in my mouth. I bit my tongue and forced a nod, watching her pack a small overnight bag. She didn't see the tightness in my jaw, the barely contained fury simmering just beneath the surface. I knew she was lying, and this time, I was going to prove it. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and called Mark. "It's happening tonight," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. He agreed to meet me nearby in case I needed backup. I felt a surge of gratitude, knowing I wasn't facing this alone. I slipped out of the house, careful not to wake the kids, and followed her car at a safe distance. The drive seemed endless, my mind racing through scenarios of what I'd find. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd confront her without letting my emotions spiral out of control. As we left the city lights behind and headed toward a small, secluded hotel on the outskirts of town, I knew there was no more doubt. This was it. She was meeting him, and there was no way to deny it. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit motel, a place that practically screamed secrecy. I watched her step out of the car, glancing around as if she sensed something was off. She clutched her bag tightly, her heels clicking against the pavement as she made her way to the entrance. I stayed in my car, hidden behind a large SUV, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold, like this was some terrible nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I waited a few minutes, then slipped out of my car and made my way to the lobby. The receptionist gave me a curious glance, but I forced a friendly smile, asking if I could use the restroom. Once inside, I steadied myself, splashing cold water on my face as I tried to brace for what was coming. This was it, the moment that would change everything. After what felt like hours, I stepped out of the restroom and noticed Sarah entering one of the rooms down the hall. She knocked twice, then slipped inside, closing the door behind her. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep moving, to walk past the door as casually as I could manage. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt like I might be sick. I wanted to barge in, to scream, to demand an explanation, but I held back. I had to be smart about this. I moved down the hall and dialed Mark. "I need you here," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "They're in room 217. Mark was there in less than 10 minutes, his presence like an anchor keeping me from losing control. He gave me a nod, a silent reminder to stay calm. Together, we made our way back down the hall, stopping just outside her door. I raised my hand to knock, but Mark placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Are you sure?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Once you do this, there's no going back." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. I was sure, more sure than I'd ever been about anything. I nodded, then raised my hand and knocked twice. There was a moment of silence, a breathless pause as I heard shuffling from the other side of the door. Then it opened, and Sarah stood there, her face a mask of shock and horror as she realized who was standing in front of her. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, clutching her robe tightly around her. She glanced behind her, and I saw the shadow of a man moving in the room, a figure I knew all too well. "Funny," I said, my voice cold and even. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Her face paled, her lips forming words she couldn't seem to say. She looked back at Jake, who was now frozen in place, his own expression a mix of fear and guilt. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Two people who'd spent months weaving a web of lies now caught like deer in headlights. "I think we need to have a little chat," I said, stepping into the room, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. Mark followed close behind, closing the door as he leaned back against it, arms crossed, a silent witness to the reckoning that was about to unfold. Sarah tried to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her. "Save it," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I've seen enough, heard enough. Now, you're going to tell me everything." The room fell into a tense silence, thick with the weight of what had just been exposed. Sarah glanced at Jake, her eyes wide, desperate, as if she was searching for some kind of escape. But there was nowhere left to hide. and for the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. I was no longer a pawn in her twisted game. I was the one in control now, and I intended to make every single moment of this count. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and erratic, as I stared at Sarah and Jake. They looked like cornered animals, stripped of their usual defenses. There was no way out, no excuse they could muster that would make this go away. I took a deep breath, letting the tension build, letting them feel the weight of the situation. So, I began, my voice low and steady. This is what you've been up to? Sneaking around, lying to me, lying to our kids. I saw a flicker of shame cross Sarah's face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head. No, I'm not interested in your explanations. Not yet. I want the truth, the whole truth. No games. Jake, standing a few feet away, had his arms crossed, his face a mixture of guilt and arrogance. He cleared his throat, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Look, man, I don't know what you think is going on here. Save it, I interrupted, my voice sharp. I know exactly what's going on. I've seen the messages, the late-night calls. I followed you here, watched you both sneaking around like you had something to hide. So don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is anything less than what it looks like. Jake's face went pale, and for a moment, he looked like he might try to argue. But one look at Sarah's expression, and he knew there was no point. The truth was out, plain and simple, and there was no burying it now. I turned my attention to Sarah, my heart pounding as I took in the woman I'd spent the last 16 years with. The woman I'd built a life with, trusted with everything I had. And here she was, standing in front of me, looking like she barely knew me. Why, Sarah? My voice cracked, despite my best efforts to stay composed. Why him? Why any of this? She looked down, avoiding my gaze. For the first time, she seemed lost, like a child caught in a lie too big to deny. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know how it happened. It just did. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that surprised even me. It just did? That's all you have to say? You tore our family apart, broke every promise you ever made, and all you can tell me is it just happened? She winced, her eyes brimming with tears, but I couldn't find it in myself to feel sympathy. This was the woman who'd smiled at me every morning, kissed our kids goodnight, and then turned around to build a secret life with another man. Jake, apparently finding his voice, stepped forward. Look, this wasn't just some fling. Sarah and he hesitated, his eyes flicking to Sarah, as if waiting for her approval to continue. We had a connection. Something you wouldn't understand. I felt a wave of anger rise up, so strong it took everything in me not to lash out. A connection? I spat. A connection? That's your excuse? You think you can waltz in here, destroy my marriage, and justify it all because you had a connection? Sarah's face twisted in pain as she turned toward him, her voice desperate. Jake, stop. Please. This isn't helping. But Jake wasn't done. He looked at me, a smirk creeping onto his face, his tone dripping with smugness. You were the one who couldn't keep her happy. Maybe if you'd been a better husband, this wouldn't have happened. Those words felt like a slap to the face. I clenched my fists, my vision blurring as I fought to keep my composure. But I refused to let him see me break. Not here, not now. So that's it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You both think this is my fault? After everything I've done for this family, everything I've given to her, this is what I get. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my arm. No, it's not like that. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I stepped back, putting distance between us. Her touch felt like poison, a reminder of everything she'd done, everything she'd lied about. You're only sorry because you got caught, I said coldly. If I hadn't followed you tonight, you'd still be carrying on behind my back. You wouldn't have told me anything. She bit her lip, silent tears streaming down her face, but I felt no pity. She was the one who had made these choices, who had destroyed our family for a thrill, a so-called connection. Mark, who had been standing by the door watching the whole thing, cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough," he said quietly. "It's clear what's been going on here." I nodded, my gaze fixed on Sarah. "I'll be filing for divorce. I won't let you keep pretending, not after this. The kids deserve better than to be raised in a house built on lies." Sarah's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd once loved, the woman I thought would stand by me no matter what. But that woman was a memory now, nothing more than a faded image in the rearview mirror of a life that was over. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, Mark close behind me. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I left the hotel, like the weight I'd been carrying had finally lifted. The truth was brutal, but it was also freeing. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood. And as I drove away, leaving Sarah and Jake behind, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The ride home was a blur. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was a storm of images, memories, and fragments of the last 16 years that Sarah and I had shared. Every kiss, every laugh, every quiet moment together had been rewritten, tarnished by the truth. But beneath the sadness, beneath the rage that flared each time I thought about her betrayal, there was a calm determination that felt strange but somehow right. I was finally seeing things clearly. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, silent. Our home, once a place of warmth and laughter, now felt cold, like a shell of what it used to be. The kids were sleeping upstairs, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring up at their windows, feeling the crushing weight of what all this would mean for them. They had no idea their world was about to be turned upside down. I walked inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. I sank onto the couch, my mind racing with all the things I'd need to figure out: the legal process, how to break the news to the kids, the details of separating a life that had been intertwined with someone else's for so long. But despite the overwhelming to-do list forming in my head, one thought stood out above all the others. I had to be strong for them. No matter how much this hurt, no matter how many questions I had, I couldn't let my kids pay the price for Sarah's choices. As I sat there, the night stretched on, and memories kept flooding back, each one bringing its own sting. I thought about the times Sarah and I had stayed up late, planning vacations, dreaming about the future, talking about growing old together. All of it seemed so hollow now, like someone else's life. I wondered if any of it had ever been real, if I'd simply been too blind, too trusting to see the cracks that had been there all along. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of little footsteps coming down the stairs. My son, Ryan, shuffled into the living room, rubbing his eyes and giving me a sleepy smile. "Dad, why are you on the couch?" he asked, his voice small and innocent. I forced a smile, patting the seat next to me. "Just needed some fresh air last night," I said, ruffling his hair as he climbed up beside me. I looked at him, at the quiet trust in his eyes, and my heart ached. Soon, he and his sister would know the truth, and their safe, happy world would come crashing down. But I promised myself that I'd do everything in my power to cushion the blow. Over the next few days, I kept my distance from Sarah. She tried calling, texting, even showed up at the house once, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. There was nothing left to say. I'd made up my mind, and I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of begging for forgiveness. I knew her too well by now. She'd try to twist things, try to make me question myself, but I was done playing her games. I had seen everything I needed to see. I focused on the kids, trying to keep things as normal as possible. I kept up with our routine, making their breakfasts, helping with homework, listening to their stories about school. I wanted to soak up every moment, to remind myself of the love that still existed in this broken home, even if it had been fractured by Sarah's choices. And in those moments, I found a sense of purpose, a reminder of what mattered most. A few nights later, after I'd put the kids to bed, I got a message from Sarah. This time, it wasn't an apology or a plea to talk. It was a simple line that hit me harder than anything else she'd said. "I want to talk to the kids." I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. I knew I couldn't keep this from them forever, but the thought of sitting them down, of explaining why their mother wouldn't be here every day, felt like a nightmare. But if anyone was going to tell them, it had to be me. The next day, I took the kids out for ice cream, trying to make the moment feel as light as possible, even though my chest felt like it was in a vice. We sat on a bench outside, the warm sun shining down, and I watched as they giggled and shared their favorite flavors with each other. They were so innocent, so blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. I took a deep breath and cleared my throat. "Hey, guys, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, my voice steady, though inside I felt like I was crumbling. They both looked at me, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Your mom and we've been having some problems lately. Sometimes, even when people care about each other, they can't always make things work the way they want to," I said, searching for the right words. "Your mom and I won't be living together anymore." They stared at me, their faces a mix of confusion and sadness. My daughter, Emma, spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "Does that mean you're not going to be together?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sweetheart. But it doesn't mean we love you any less. We'll always be here for you, no matter what." Their questions came slowly at first, then in a flood. What would happen to our house where they'd stay if they'd still see both of us? I answered each one as best as I could, trying to hold back my own tears as I watched their world shift before my eyes. It was one of the hardest moments of my life, but I knew it was necessary. They needed to know they still had me, even if everything else felt uncertain. When we left, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It was out in the open now. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least, for my kids, there was no more hiding. In the days after I told the kids, life fell into a rhythm that was unfamiliar but somehow steady. Sarah had moved out, and the house was quieter, the air heavy with the absence of her presence. There was a strange relief in that silence, a sense that I could finally breathe, even if the future felt daunting. I was on my own with the kids now, and though the responsibility weighed heavily, it was also grounding. I had a purpose, to rebuild, not just for me, but for them. Sarah still texted occasionally, mostly asking about the kids, and sometimes she'd slip in apologies or reminders of happier memories. But I couldn't go back. Whatever we'd once shared had been irreversibly tainted. I couldn't forget that image of her with Jake, the lies, the betrayal. It was like a scar that would always be there, a reminder of how fragile trust could be. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the quiet settling around me like a blanket. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the painful moments of the past, not the immediate plans for tomorrow, but the years ahead. I realized that there was a world beyond this betrayal, that I could move forward, even if it felt like a monumental task. I thought about Mark and the countless hours he'd spent talking me through the worst of it. I realized just how rare it was to have a friend who would stand by you through something so raw and ugly. Maybe, someday, I'd feel ready to open up to someone else, to let someone new into my life. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was there. The days turned into weeks, and I began to notice small changes in myself. I was no longer waking up with that sinking feeling in my chest, and there were moments, unexpected flashes of happiness, that caught me off guard. A laugh with the kids over breakfast, a peaceful evening spent reading in silence. It was as though I was rediscovering who I was outside of being Sarah's husband. Then, one night, Sarah showed up unannounced. She stood on the doorstep, her face pale and tired, her eyes heavy with regret. I took a deep breath, knowing that seeing her would only stir up all the old wounds, but I couldn't turn her away. She was, after all, still the mother of my children. "I just wanted to talk," she said quietly, her voice fragile. I could see the weight of her own choices bearing down on her, the regret etched into every line of her face. I never thought things would end up like this." I nodded, gesturing for her to sit on the porch with me. "Neither did I said, my voice steady but distant. There was no point in rehashing everything, but I could tell she needed to say her piece. She looked down, her hands twisting nervously. "I know I ruined everything. I hurt you, and I hurt the kids. I don't know what I was thinking." Her voice broke, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had loved, the woman I had shared dreams with. But that woman was gone now, replaced by someone I'd barely recognized. I can't change what happened, Sarah, I said quietly, my voice surprisingly calm. And I don't hate you. But I can't pretend that things can go back to the way they were. Too much has happened. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us caught in the memories, the what-ifs, and the painful reality of what we'd become. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her fully, but in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. I could finally close the chapter on this part of my life. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into building a new life. The kids and I settled into a new routine, one that was simple but ours. I found myself looking forward to the small, quiet moments we shared, the laughter, the messiness, the unexpected joy that came with being fully present. I was no longer defined by what I'd lost, but by what I still had, and that was more than enough. One afternoon, as I was watching my kids play in the yard, I realized that I'd found something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. The anger, the betrayal, the sadness, they were still there, but they no longer held power over me. They were just parts of my story, pieces of a past I could leave behind. And as I looked out at my kids, laughing and carefree, I knew that we'd be okay. We'd find a way to heal, to move forward, to build a new kind of happiness. Life wasn't perfect, and it wasn't what I'd planned, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.